Shower thought. Everyone wants to be normal, but no one wants to be thought of as average. I was reading a fascinating book from 1992 called A Century of War by William Engdahl. It's basically a volume whose subject is petroleum and how it affects geopolitics. What interested me were the parallels between the lead up to World War I and now. For instance, we forget today, but the financier J.P. Morgan was extraordinarily powerful. After the Panic of 1907, he single-handedly loaned the Treasury his own gold to backstop the U.S. government. This favor set him in good stead going forward. A few years later, when World War I happened, Engdahl writes, "The role of Morgan in the New York financial community was of supreme importance to the war efforts of all the Entente powers. Under an exclusive arrangement, purchase of all American munitions, war materials, as well as necessary grains and food supplies for Britain, France, and the other Allied powers in Europe was funneled through the House of Morgan. Such power in the hands of one single investment house, given the scale of British war requirements, was without precedent. So all wartime debt, bonds, and financial transactions flowed through one man, Morgan. Engdahl said that at the time, it was without precedent. There is a precedent now, and currently it's been repeated, with one Larry Fink from asset management company BlackRock. BlackRock has $11 trillion under management, making it the wealthiest entity on planet Earth behind only China and the United States. After the 2008 financial collapse, the Treasury tapped Fink to do bailouts on behalf of the U.S. government. They outsourced their responsibilities to this one shadowy man. With millions of companies on the verge of insolvency, they all clamored to ingratiate themselves with Fink. He said that he'd do bailouts to them on one condition, that they adopt his ESG system.
Where does BlackRock go moving forward? What does a man do when he already has everything? In 2019, people were petitioning against BlackRock for being among the top shareholders for oil and coal production. In fact, investing in heavy pollution industries has basically been the backbone of BlackRock's portfolio over the years. So according to Larry, they're making a push towards environmental, social, and sustainable investing. Whether or not they actually believe in this stuff is yet to be known. Nevertheless, it does appear they've made legit efforts to expand into this more eco-friendly market. With new environmentally focused products, they've partnered with activist investors, they backed a shareholder resolution basically forcing ExxonMobil to get serious about climate change. Larry even straight up wrote a letter telling companies that they need to, quote, contribute to society to receive his firm's support. This new push for sustainable investing, or ESG investing, is a big reason why you see so many corporations trying to appear woke these days.
If you want to invest in a company, they will, on their investor relations page, they'll show you their ESG score. ESG stands for environmental, social, corporate governance. And this is where the woke culture comes from. So they've created this kind of phony baloney rating system that says, well, if you, I'm exaggerating, but if you mention that you are, have a green agenda and you believe in carbon credits and you might trade some credits somewhere, then you get a higher score and therefore you're more investable. And it's very interesting to see how big investors like insurance company, institutional investors, they are steering away from anything that does not have the right ESG rating. And so in order to have investors continue to be interested in the stock, which is important for the company, for its perception, certainly for the officers of the company and the shareholders, you have to move this along continuously. And so it's very simple to see why doing a woke ad as Nike or as any other company, Pride Month is fantastic because Pride is easy. Throw up some flags, show the right people, trans, whatever, and you got a high ESG score.
Not only did Fink oversee the bond bailouts after 2008, he was tapped to essentially run the Federal Reserve and was in charge of the Federal Reserve's coronavirus stimulus. Not only is Fink a replay of J.P. Morgan, but other factors seem to be setting the stage for a new world war. Engdahl draws attention to the oil shocks of the 1970s and how that destabilized the global financial system, something we're repeating now with green legislation meant to choke off petroleum to the planet. Well, that happened before in the 1970s. Engdahl writes, but with the application of the Thatcher government's interest rate monetary shock happening June 1979, followed that October by the same policy from Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve, the interest rate burdens of the Third World debt compounded overnight, as London's interest rates climbed from an average of 7% in early 1978 to almost 20% on the London Stock Exchange. With this one factor alone, Third World debtor countries would have collapsed into default as the altered debt service conditions imposed on them by the creditor banks added an unpayable new amount to their previous onerous debt burden. But what was most unsettling were the uncanny parallels of policy then imposed by the leading London and New York bankers. Virtually letter by letter a rerun of the same bank's Versailles war reparations debt recycling folly of the 1920s, which collapsed into the chaos of October 1929 with the crash of the New York stock market. Basically, oil cartels in the 1970s wanted to quadruple the price of oil to increase their profits, so they created artificial shortages. This led to price inflation as every product had to be shipped to stores. If it was transported on a boat, airplane, or truck, it required oil. If oil was more expensive, so were the products. The Fed stepped in to stop the price inflation by raising the interest rates, just as they're doing today. But by raising interest rates, they raised the interest on the debt owed by the Third World, crippling them. They were suddenly so broke that they could no longer afford to industrialize. All their productive investments stopped, and their dwindling funds went to buy expensive oil to keep their energy grids going. When they couldn't afford it, they disastrously took out short-term loans from New York and London banks, which plunged them even deeper into debt. We're watching an almost exact replay of this today, except the pretext for choking off the oil are new Green New Deal, zero-carbon emissions commitments that these countries are being coerced into entering. This ensures that inflation remains high, interest rates are hiked, and the Third World is forced to remain vassal states in a sort of neo-colonial scam being enacted by Western banks and oil cartels. It's empire by another name. But what makes it interesting is that this is similar to the imperial methods Britain used in the run-up to the First World War, before they collapsed. At the time, England wasn't paying attention to the United States. America was still rebuilding itself after the Civil War, so it was taken out of commission. England's main economic rival was Germany. The analog of that happening today is the United States and its rivalry with China. Graham Allison writes about this in his book, Destined for War. This situation has happened in the past, and when it did, war happened 12 times out of 16 times. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Straight from the New American Magazine, the essential news source for freedom-loving Americans, we bring you Beyond the Cover, where influential contributors to the magazine's print edition join host Gary Benoit to discuss their articles, often offering important insights not found in the articles themselves. Head to thenewamerican.com to learn more.